Welcome to Let's Make a Quilt Together. Right now we are between projects, so I thought this would be a good time to let you take a peek into my gallery. Today I will share 12 of my quilts with you. Since every quilt has a story, I get to share a few stories with you as well. Many of my quilts are made as samples of the project that I was about to teach. I do that so that I can better guide my students through the project. I want their experience to be as smooth and enjoyable as possible. I get inspiration for my quilts from a variety of sources: magazines, books, the internet, etc. Actually, I don't have enough time to make all of the inspirations running around in my head. The first quilt I'm going to share with you is a sampler quilt. This is one of the first quilts that I ever made. It's so early in my quilting career that it has no label on it and is completely hand quilted. When I was taught to quilt, hand quilting was the only way to complete the quilt. It's probably the last time I used so much white or cream in a quilt. It exemplifies what I was taught. It's a sampler quilt with 9 different blocks. It is also an example of what happens when you buy high loft batting in a package. After 1 or 2 washings, the batting is now very much almost not there, and the batting is no longer a high loft batting at all. The quilt now feels as if it has no batting at all. The blocks in this quilt come from a book I bought many years ago. The next quilt is called High and Low Blues. It's a Bargello quilt. This was an early project that I taught. Once I finished the Bargello design, I realized the quilt was not big enough for me. It was then that I knew for sure that I like big quilts. Thus, this quilt has several borders added to it. Fabrics look like a sunrise or sunset to make the Bargello. The quilt was quilted shortly after I learned to free motion quilt. So I quilted the whole thing in spirals, and I love the effect of the spirals going around on a linear quilt. The next quilt is an I Spy quilt, and it's called Two Stayed Too Long. This quilt reminds me of my grandmother. I was raised on a farm, and my grandmother canned fruits and vegetables as they were harvested in the summer and early fall. However, my grandmother was quite particular about her jars and how they were organized. She would never have had shelves that looked like these. There would be no books on her shelves. All of the fruits that belonged together would be together. Notice there is a jar of lemons out of place on this quilt. There would be no basket of fresh apples, especially a basket so full that the apples were falling out of it. Worst of all, 2 jars of canned bell peppers have stayed on the shelf so long that they have a cobweb on them. Thus the name of the quilt. It was so much fun to make, and the name was just so obvious. The next quilt is called Woven in Kenya, and it is the ribbon weave pattern that I got out of a book by Bethany Reynolds. I have had the good fortune to travel to Kenya 5 times as part of a missions group from my church. Of course, each time I went, I bought fabric. This quilt represents my first attempt to use some of my African fabric in one of my quilts. I saw this pattern ribbon weave, and I fell in love with it immediately and knew I had to use my fabrics to make it. Adding the green and tan fabrics makes all of this quilt come together. My African fabrics sing in this quilt. It is a very large quilt. I added 5 borders and absolutely love it. This quilt is called Blue and Gold Magic. I happened to click on Jenny Doan making magic squares one evening. I thought they were so cute I knew I had to make them. I decided to go through my stash and pull out as many of the blues and golds as I could find. Then I found a multicolor fabric for the sashing, as well as blue and gold fabric for the borders. This was quilted using a walking foot and quilter's bar to create a grid on the surface. This quilting was perfect for the design. My next quilt is a walk in the park. This is a great jelly roll quilt, one white and one print. This design by Ellie Roberts of Craft Sew Create sews together quickly and easily. I was in a quilt shop in Westminster, Maryland several years ago and saw the exact same quilt hanging on the wall. While the pattern is popular, that wasn't a surprise. However, that quilt was made from the exact same jelly rolls as the ones I used. I shared that with the shop owner. We were both quite surprised and decided that quilting has its connections no matter where you are. To make this quilt a little more interesting, I used different quilting in each block center, and I am really in awe of how this turned out. When I look at these blocks, they remind me of tissue boxes. The title of the pattern begged me to use a photograph of my girls on the label. They were strolling through a pumpkin patch when I took this photograph, and it reminds me of strolling through the park. This next quilt is called Breakout Chains. Every year for the last 10 or 11 years, our family has vacationed in North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and for a couple of those years, I took my sewing machine with me, determined to fill some of my downtime with sewing. I had seen this block on the internet on favequilts.com and decided I would work on it at the beach. Sure enough, when everyone cleared out of our unit to go their various ways for the day, I sewed. I got most of the blocks made that week and finished putting the quilt together when I got home. I challenged myself to extend the chains out into the border. The mottle blue fabric reminds me of the beach and the sound of the waves as I sewed. Thus the title Breakout Chains. I like to think of this quilt as a modern-day Irish chain. Linked Together Forever. Once again, a block on favequilts.com caught my eye, and I had to make it. I went through my stash, found the fabrics, and got started on the block. I love the interlocking feature of the blocks, making it look far more complex than it is. Once the top was made about 5 years ago, it was put on a pile of other unfinished quilts. Last April, I pulled it out and decided to quilt it. I used straight line stitching with the rows of stitching going in a variety of directions. I used a variegated thread with the stitching lines 1 inch apart. It took all of April and some of May to complete the quilting. But once it was done, I loved it. This quilt is kind of a quilt that can be masculine or feminine, formal or informal, gentle or not gentle, all at the same time. This is a quilt that every time I look at it, I get something new from it. It is rare in my collection because it has no border. This little quilt is called Happy. I wanted to teach my beginner quilting class how to add sashing and cornerstones to their quilts. I had a pack of colorful 10-inch squares and a colorful jelly roll. I knew they would complement each other. I sewed this quilt while my husband was in a rehabilitation facility in Maryland. I lived with our daughter and her family in Maryland, so I had constant contact with my husband. I sewed at night and on days when the weather was too bad to drive to the rehab facility. As this quilt went together, I loved the effect the colors had on me. When my husband's health improved so that we could move back home to Virginia, I quilted this little quilt. Once it was finished, I could call it nothing but happy. My husband was doing much better. He and I were getting reestablished in our routines back at home, and I was all set to teach my class. Once again, favequilts.com had a quilt block that appealed to me. It was called the Sorbet or the Rainbow block. It required beautiful fruit-colored fabrics. You can use jelly rolls or cut strips. The whole quilt is made from 2.5-inch strips. Since the colors are all linear, I quilted it in tiny circles. The quilting was very time-consuming, but well worth it. It makes you want to put a scoop of whipped cream on top of it, get a spoon, and dig in. And so it is called Sorbet. Anyone? This one is my color Rhapsody. The pandemic hit just as our church quilting group was planning to start a quilt guild in our spring-summer class. As we isolated ourselves, we longed for a way to be together and to quilt again. Once again, the internet came to our rescue. I happened to see Urban Scandinavian half-square triangle quilt. I made my version of this quilt. I struggled with how to teach my class since we could not meet in person. I shared this with my son, who immediately had the solution. He would create a YouTube channel for me, video me teaching, upload the video to the YouTube channel, and my students could watch the videos when they could, playing them over and over again. I decided to have a weekly Zoom meeting with my students. I taught my students how to make this, and we had a great time. The focus of the lesson was handling triangles. This quilt will always have a special place in my quilt making, teaching experiences. And then this one is called Michelle's Design. I get teary-eyed. I get inspiration from a variety of sources. However, I got inspired from a source that was a complete surprise. My granddaughter, who at the time was either 4 or 5, was playing with perlier beads. She knew the rule in the house was that she could put the beads together in whatever design she wanted, but she had to come to me to iron them so that they would fuse together. She was not allowed to do that. Once she handed me her design to be ironed, I knew it had to be a quilt or a quilt block. I asked her, once she had gotten it and she looked at it and had laid it down, I asked her if I could have it. And she said yes. She really just enjoyed the making of the designs, not necessarily wanting to keep them. Finally, while we were living in Maryland during my husband's rehabilitation, I was able to design this quilt, sew the quilt together, and thus I have this beautiful quilt called Michelle's Design. You get to see her design in the beads, and you get to see how the design became my quilt. And this quilt, you know, will always have a special place in my heart. Happy quilting! Bye-bye!